brief WebEx interface tour. Today's webinar is entitled Improvisation at Work, Communicating and Innovating at Your Library. Your presenters are Cheryl Gold and Chris Sams. Cheryl has been a training consultant for InfoPeople since 1996. She's delivered workshops for libraries on a wide range of topics. Recent additions to her toolbox include working with management teams for improved communication and collaboration, as well as helping organize library staff days to facilitate people getting to know each other, have a bit of fun, and stay energized while learning relevant library skills. Chris delights in using improvisational theater technique as a trainer-facilitator with BATS Improv's on-the-go training program to teach spontaneity, adaptability, creativity, leadership, storytelling, communication and listening, ensemble, and team building. Chris has led workplace workshops for more than 24 companies and corporate teams. I'm now happy to introduce Cheryl and Chris.
Hello, everybody, and thanks, Eileen, for that introduction. I'm Cheryl, and
I'm Chris Sams.
And I met Chris through the Applied Improvisation Network, which is an international association of consultants that use the skills of improvisation to train in things like creativity, communication, leadership, team building, and to transform organizations to work together with the spirit of yes and we'll talk about that soon.
That's right, and I got into improvisational theater about 12 years ago, taking a class at BATS, BATS Improv in San Francisco.
So what we're going to cover today is
what we mean by improvisation,
why improvisation is useful in the library now,
and 4 key skills of improvisation.
The first one is be present.
Yes, and
take risks, mistakes, or gifts.
And finally, support your partner. So we'll also be doing a series of activities, and these are based in theater technique. They're training activities or communication exercises that will get you involved in practicing improvisation. They're the basis for how we use training.
Okay, so we're going to go ahead and do the first activity. And for this one, you're going to want to have something to write with, because we're going to ask you to write a list of words. So we're going to give you 20 seconds, and what I'd like you to do is make a list of words that relate to the word library. So go ahead and write. Actually, I'm asking you really to do this. Go ahead and write a list of words on a piece of paper that relate to the word library.
All right, and you're still on the call, so we know that we won't be having music in the background.
So go ahead, Chris. Can you talk, and let's make sure they are hearing you?
Sure. Hopefully we'll be able to speak up. We've got this handset here.
Okay, and that's 20 seconds. So if you can go ahead and stop making that list. And now we're going to ask you to make another list.
And this time we're going to ask you to write words that are unrelated. So these are unrelated words to each other.
Okay, so again, we're really asking you to go ahead and use that paper and pencil and write down for 20 seconds. I'm going to time you. All the words you can think of that are unrelated to one another. Okay, and we just a couple more seconds of that. All right. So go ahead and count the words on each list, that first list of words related to library, and then the second list of unrelated words. And once you've done that, I'd like you to go ahead and use your yes, no button, which is found under that check mark up in the participants box on the right. Did you have more words on your first list of words that related to library? And I'm going to go ahead and check the results as they come in. So we're at...
Right. As our results are coming in right now, we're at a 5-to-1 margin. More people had library-related words than unrelated words.
So just another moment to get a little more feedback.
Some of you you were counting up a long list. You wrote lots of words. That's great.
That's great. And we're still at about a 5-to-1 ratio where more people said they came up with longer lists for words that relate to library. So on first thought, you might say that being able to think about any word should be easy versus being given the limitation of writing a list of words that relate to library. But it turns out that that's not true for most of us. It's actually easier to make connections between things we already know. In some situations, this is a good thing. In other situations, it becomes a bit of a limitation because it's hard to come up with solutions for problems when we're very familiar with the problem and we think we're familiar with the solutions. We keep thinking of similar versions of solutions instead of being able to think very, very broadly.
So for our next yes/no question, did you notice that you judged whether a word was unrelated enough on the second list, and did that slow you down?
Okay, so we're going to go ahead and check the feedback result. If you could put a yes or no.
Right, and many of you also are even typing into the chat window that yes, that was true for you.
So hopefully you found that interesting. And that's an example of an improv activity that helps you work on self-awareness, which helps you to be present, to help notice how we sometimes, without realizing it, get in our own way. Because presumably writing that list of unrelated words, part of the time you spent saying, is that unrelated enough? Oh, wait, that one doesn't work there, and things like that.
That's right. So now that we've been thinking about words that relate to library and words that are unrelated, what words come to mind when you hear the word improvisation? This time let's use the chat window to type those words in.
Okay. So again, we're really asking for you to do something, which is to go ahead and type in the chat window.
Quick, inventive, comedy, on the fly, creativity. Lots of comedy and humor, I see, laughter, making things up, and silliness. Wow, these are great. Lots of fast thinking, no rules. All right, fantastic. Well, some of the words that people often come up with, and we can see it's true from our chat window, that it's somehow unprepared, it can be frightening, somehow it's irresponsible, or it has to be funny. A lot of people thought funny or clever or silly, comedy. Some of us might have said, I can never do that. All of those are different myths that we want to try to dispel today as we think about improvisation from a new lens. When I think about improvisation as a trainer, I look at all of these different skills that help us to be better communicators. At the heart of improvisation is truly about being present so that you can help to find and build connections, as many of you have pointed out in the chat window, to think quickly on your feet and to build, to say yes and build on others' ideas.
You know, for me, practicing improv activities is about many of the things on this list also, even in work situations, not just on the stage. So it's about connecting with people, becoming more aware of all the ways that I get in my own way, and finding ways to accept and build on whatever happens without judgment. I actually, before all this applied improv stuff, I had no idea how often I put pressure on myself or judged kind of my ability or my thoughts, or I need to be clever, I need to be funny, or no one's going to want to do this. And it's really been quite a relief to have this practice of applied improv in my life, not just at work, but also in my personal life.
That's right. And as a lot of people say that they think of comedy, a lot of improvisers are very funny. They come across with very funny scenes, and yet they have a skill set that helps them get to be able to do that. It is not about telling jokes, but it's about all of the skills that we're going to cover in today's webinar.
Excellent, excellent. Okay. So I want to do a little juxtaposition of library work then and now. So library work is no longer just about cataloging and organizing, or about answering questions from a limited set of materials, or finding the right book only, or it's not even only about people in the building.
That's right. That list looks really familiar to me, Cheryl. My mom was an elementary school librarian for 30 years in the public school system in North Carolina, so that I can really relate to that list.
Right, and now the library work is kind of more about connecting people with resources, empowering your customers, engaging your community, and of course still directing people to the bathrooms. So library work used to be more about working within a clear structure and following rules and enforcing policies. But nowadays, I actually don't know if any two people would agree on what library work is, but we do know it involves a lot of change and uncertainty. So I hope you'll bear with me. I'm going to take a risk and step up on my soapbox and say what I really believe, okay?
All right. Let's hear what you think, Cheryl.
So work is really about communicating with people. It requires communication. That's between your colleagues, customers, and your community. One of the things that makes it difficult to move forward in libraries, besides just money, which is definitely a problem, is people stuck in old beliefs or old mental models of what the library should be. To keep libraries viable into the future, no matter what that future looks like, we actually need to retrain the staff to be flexible and nimble and collaborative so that each person's perspective and experience can be used to create the future of the library. Whoever the leaders are now or may be in the future, they aren't going to be able to do it alone.
Bravo, bravo.
Thank you. All right, well, that was my big risk for the day, to step up on my soapbox. All right, so thank you so much.
Well, thank you. I'm glad you did.
All right. So we all know that libraries are busier in tough economic times, so I'm not even going to bother with the yes-no poll on that one. It also seems that people in the library, that's the customers and our fellow staff members, seem to be more stressed than they used to be. So if you add this to the fact that we're experiencing more budget reductions, retirements, and constantly incorporating new services and technology, staff in the libraries are coping with a lot of change and often asked to do tasks or create services in areas where nobody knows the way.
And that sounds quite a bit like what improvisers face when they improvise on stage.
Oh, imagine that. There's a good connection here between libraries and improvisation. So I'm going to ask you all, I'm going to open a poll. I'd like to ask everyone to think of the skills you'd like to have or you wish your colleagues had to thrive, or if you don't, not comfortable with thrive, even survive these days, and go ahead and answer the poll. So I'm going to open up a poll, and it should show up, I believe, on the right side of your screen. And you should be able to pick as many of these as you like. So the idea is, which of these skills do we need to thrive in the libraries?
All right. Thank you for voting. So far, all of these skills are coming up quite a bit. And we're going to extend our chat window so we can see more of the results, I think, if we can. Okay. All right. Many of you are responding. It looks like focus on positive solutions, flexibility. From our poll results, it looks like a series of snails or slugs racing each other, because all of them are getting a lot of responses. These are great. So confidence, focus on positive solutions, flexibility, and authentic, respectful communication are so far at the top of our list.
Okay, and surprise, surprise, actually 34 people have said they would like to have more challenging customers. How interesting. I'm hoping that's because you're in the spirit of improv.
That's right. So flexibility looks like it's the #1 skill that we need.
Okay, I'm going to go ahead and close the poll. Thank you so much, everyone, for responding. It'll take 20 seconds to close the poll. So there seems to be a lot of agreement that this set of skills that you looked at in the poll and that's currently on the slide are ones that we'd like people to have to get through these tough, challenging times in the libraries. And these skills map pretty much one-to-one with the skills that improvisers use and practice for doing improvisational theater. Now, I'm as uncomfortable with the idea of doing improvisational theater as the next person. However, the activities that improvisers use to prepare to be on stage are actually a lot of fun to practice, and really anyone can do them. In fact, if you've been in one of my Info People workshops in the last 5 years, you've actually done a bunch of these activities already, so it's not really scary.
That's right.
All right, so the 4 skills of improvisation we're going to cover today are
to be present,
to yes and,
to take risks and recognize that mistakes are gifts,
and to support your partner.
So these are the 4 that are primary skills within improvisation. Obviously, there are a lot of skills that improvisers use and practice, and we're going to start with the first one, be present.
Okay, be present. So Chris, when you're teaching in companies, how do you explain be present?
Well, first I have to get people to really be present in the moment, show up in the room. I have to ask them to put their smartphones away and not check email. We really have to get people present. And so we often do activities that will involve them directly so that they can participate. In fact, let's do one now. I'm going to ask people here on the webinar to close their eyes and point to things in the room that they're in and name them. So go ahead, where you are as an individual or in a group, that's fine. Go ahead and just close your eyes and say aloud some of the things in your space. Point. Say what you remember. Try to do a few more things.
Yeah.
And now, how much do you notice of what's really there? Go ahead and open your eyes and look around.
So we're actually going to ask you to sort of notice what you actually missed.
That's right. I imagine that we missed several things. This idea of being present is very difficult because when we're so familiar with an environment, it's hard to see that environment clearly. We want to be able to find a fresh perspective, and we'll start to notice different things that we might have missed as we do with this exercise. When I teach companies to be present and teams to be present, it's about showing up with that personal responsibility to be present with one another and really to pay attention to what's happening in the moment, to be engaged. And so, Cheryl, how is the skill of being present relevant to you?
Well, it's interesting because usually when I think of being present, I think of being in some beautiful place where it's really quiet and preferably in nature. So that's my personal version. But when I think of what does be present mean in the library, it really means that be open and focused and not making assumptions. So in libraries, there's a lot of opportunities to actually practice building the muscle of being present. It can happen in meetings. It can happen with your customers, even the challenging ones and the ones that you're comfortable with, and certainly with colleagues in conversation. It's kind of similar in a way to doing kind of customer interview or reference interviews, because doing the reference interview involves a lot of listening and being present to really understand customer needs. So this shouldn't be a big stretch for people. With colleagues, having the ability to be present in meetings or in conversations and actually listen without bias or judgment would likely result in quicker decisions. When I sit in meetings, I see a lot of assumptions being made about what people mean, often resulting in knee-jerk reactions or just as bad, passive-aggressive behavior. Libraries, like every workplace, would benefit from less judging and more listening. In fact, I think the whole world would benefit from less judging and more listening.
I think so.
And then the idea of being present for things like problem solving is that when you notice more about what's going on around you, you may find sometimes there's a solution right in front of you, but you're not seeing it. This is something the neuroscientists might call attention blindness. We're actually going to do an activity around that.
That's right. And it's not surprising we have attention blindness when we see, as people point out in the chat window, about how there are so many zillions of things in our environment that we can lose things right there in the piles of things in front of us.
Yes, easily, easily, easily. So we're going to ask you to do another activity. So right now, for the next about 15 seconds, I'd like you to look around whatever room you're in and notice all the things that are red. So go ahead and, if you would do that now for 15, 20 seconds, notice all the things that are red in your environment. And you can go ahead, keep looking around, people, at things.
Yeah, I see a few things here that are red.
Okay, and now if you would, I'm going to ask you to close your eyes and think of how many things are in the room that are green. Okay, keep your eyes closed. So think of how many things you can think of that are green. And go ahead and open your eyes if you're done with that. And you should see another poll having shown up. And this poll is asking you how many things could you think of that were green. And the choice, you're just going to pick one. It would be either 0, 1, 2, or 3 or more. And so I'm going to give a moment for people to respond to this poll.
Great. It looks like many of you have found 3 or more, which is a really great result. And it's not surprising that again, several of us have found fewer than 3 things that we can find that are green.
It's funny, the first time I did that activity, I couldn't come up with anything, and I was so amazed.
Yeah, I'm sure I had 0 as well. And in fact, we had 31 of the 300 plus also had 0 as well.
Good. It's also interesting to note that there's actually a fair number of people. We're getting near 100 people who've said that they did come up with 3 or more things that were green. And good for you for being able to sort of have a nice broad focus for what's around you.
That's right. It might help when we have lots of those junk piles lying around. Maybe there are a lot of green folders and things like that.
So this activity is to show how when we focus on one thing, it's hard sometimes to see what else is in our environment, even though it can be right in front of us. So we see what we focus on, and consequently, we sometimes miss solutions or resources that are right in front of us.
That's right. And when we focus on others, that takes us into our next area about yes and.
Okay. So, Chris, how do you explain yes and in your work?
Well, basically, I help people to understand yes and by the concept of avoiding or postponing the no. It's about accepting ideas or offers or someone else's input and postponing critique or judgment. It's really about a solutions focus instead of looking at the problem. It's related to another technique called appreciative inquiry, where we focus on what's working, what we can do more of. By saying yes, it takes us far fast, and it certainly takes practice.
You were telling me about sort of a fun activity you do sometimes. I'm wondering if you'd share that with the group here.
Sure. Well, one of the activities we do is coming up with an ad campaign that they have 3 minutes. It's a timed activity where they have to come up with a product, a fanciful product, some kind of name for the product, a jingle, a slogan, a spokesperson, an entire infomercial content for how they're going to basically sell that product.
And I'm wondering if, just for fun, if you guys would take a moment and you had to sell this strange-looking square watermelon you see on the slide. Why don't you throw a few things up there about yes and this idea. If you had to do an ad campaign, what might you call this? Or
That's right. Names for the product, uses, benefits.
It's hip to be square. That's great.
Nice. That's a great slogan. Yes, easy to stack, easy to divide, slice, compact. You are finding a lot of the positive features of this. And so if we were to try to come up with an ad campaign, we would have to work really quickly to just take the first idea and roll with it, building off of each other's ideas instead of trying to come up with new ideas. Often they won't be able to complete that activity unless they're willing to build on something someone else has already written.
Oh, you guys are, what excellent contributions you're making. What fun.
That's right. It's fun to see creativity, and individual creativity will build on it when we work in collaboration with others.
Great. So we're going to do a activity that you can do with your, and thanks so much for your contributions in chat. I actually want to keep going with that, but we need to go to the next slide. So for this next slide, we're going to ask you to do a yes, but activity. So we often say we have built up our buts, and we need to work on our ands. But for now, we're going to play with our buts. So if you could go ahead, I hope you take that correctly. So there's a phrase on the slide. Libraries should reduce their book collections and allocate more space to community gathering spaces. So for now, for the next 2 minutes, I'd like you to yes, but that in the chat window so that we can all see it. What are all the yes, but responses you might get to that statement if you were in a meeting and people were stressed and hurried?
Right. So sure. Yes, where did all the books go? People still want books. Where do we check out the books? Yes, resources are important.
Yes, but what if the computers are, they're going by so fast they're hard to read. And this is actually excellent. We sort of have built up this muscle of yes-butting, and it's usually kind of flows freely.
That's right. It's easy to come up with these ideas for a lot of people, and a lot of different ideas. As we're looking through this list, there are a lot of different ways that we could basically shoot down that idea. Okay,
and so we don't want to just stay in this space of yes-butting. I'm going to ask you to stop, if it's possible, with the chat window yes, but, and switch over to yes-anding this statement. So we're going to leave the same statement up there. Libraries should reduce their book collections and allocate more space to community gathering spaces. So can people start yes-anding this idea? So what are the possibilities here?
Great. And this may take a moment to shift. Yes, it brings people in.
Yes, and increase e-books.
Yes, and there's extra space.
Yes, and we'll do more interlibrary loan.
Yes, and we're a stronger force in the community.
Yes, and it will bring more people into the library.
Yes, and it creates more of a community culture.
And it creates more civic involvement.
And more fun.
Increased tech resources.
Great. We can have more conversations and more programming and serve the people. Wonderful. So this list is also readily flowing forth with a lot of bubbling forth with ideas. If we think about doing another yes-no poll, did you find yourself preferring to participate in the yes and version versus the yes but version?
Yeah, if you can go ahead and use your yes-no feedback button for that. Did you have a preference for
yes and?
Yes and.
All right. Our tallies are starting to come in, and wow, so far the score is 25 to 4 in favor of yes and over yes but. This may change as we get more results in, so we'll see. Many of you are still yes anding and yes butting in the chat window, which is great. So it looks like with our poll, as it's starting to wrap up, we'll put about 20 more seconds for people to respond here.
So we're now at about 60 to 15 in terms of the preference for being involved in the yes activity.
That's right, 4 to 1. So if we think about simply which one produced more ideas to consider and which one moves the conversation forward, I think that many of us would recognize yes and.
Tends to have more interesting ideas, and certainly tends to feel better when you have a yes and kind of conversation. So I'd like to encourage you that to try to notice when yes but is getting in the way of your meetings or your interactions, and try yes anding a situation. Though it's much more effective if you get your colleagues or your team to start yes anding each other, you can actually do it on your own with your customers and colleagues, and it will make a difference for both you and for them.
That's right. That's a great practical application of how yes and can work for the library, I think.
So in my workshops now, I often talk about these skills that require practice. It's sort of like you got to build up the muscle. So we want to, yes anding is like building up the muscle of finding what's right. So we too often shut down or block progress, and in the improv world we talk about blocking. So yes but is like a block, which shuts down a scene or shuts down a conversation. And yes and is about building. So I wanted to give you an example of where I saw this. In one of my workshops, I set up two groups to argue about moving from a circulation and reference desk to a merged desk. I'm guessing many of you have been through this process, where both the reference and circ would take place at a single service point. The librarians on one side were arguing for two desks and said that they would lose patron privacy, and they kept repeating that statement. The argument degraded, with each side stating their position repeatedly. But strangely to me, nobody said, yes and, privacy is really important in the library, so let's look at how we can merge the desks and solve the privacy problem too.
That's right. I think it's important to remember that yes and doesn't mean complete and total agreement. It means your willingness to say, I hear you, and I'll postpone that negativity or critique or criticism to see what could get created. It lets possibility and ideas live. It means I'm willing to accept another perspective or point of view.
What's fun to be around people like that?
I think so. As some of the people point out in our chat window, it's like it helps to remove the stumbling blocks, and I think that's important. It helps people not be put on the defensive so quickly, to have to defend an idea.
Yeah. You know, that's interesting that you mentioned that, Chris. Recently, over the holidays, I had occasions to be with in two different situations with people who are graduate school professors. And I was struck in those conversations how with almost each idea that was generated in the conversation, their first response was what would not work about the idea or what might be wrong about the idea. They've built up the muscle of finding what's wrong so completely that they didn't actually spend any time on whether the idea had any merit.
That's right. And sometimes those contributions can be helpful in idea evaluation. When we're trying to come up with new ideas and see what's possible, I think the idea of postponing that evaluation for letting ideas be able to be in a generative state is really important. When I work with companies, we use yes and for that specific reason, for brainstorming and creative problem solving. Too often we're focused on the problem or the turf wars a department has, and we're not geared up we're not geared up properly to be able to build on this muscle. Instead, we're geared up with arsenal to shoot down the other points of view. The gift of Yes and is really in this area of teamwork and cooperation. I think specifically around innovation, collaboration, and risk-taking. It leads more to action than inaction.
Excellent. And who doesn't want more of that? So we're going to go ahead and move on to our third skill, which is about taking risks, mistakes or gifts. So Chris, again, how do you talk about risk with your clients?
Well, we can even think about it in terms of today's webinar. People took a risk today by being here, for something called improvisation, which could be fearful or comedy or, wondering about the relevance. Some people have taken even more risks by participating in the chat, and many of you have taken even bigger risks by being willing to close your eyes and try stuff out loud, especially with kids or animals, other things in the chat window said that they were being watched by others. So that takes a big risk and some courage to do that. Taking risks isn't really about jumping out of airplanes, per se. It's about trying something new that's unusual for us. For instance, Dan Klein, a Stanford improv teacher and professor at Stanford University, talks about this encouraging people to take smart risks. So there's a place for smart risk-taking.
Great. I often hear or read that this idea of risk-taking has a lot to do with innovation, that if you don't risk, you're not going to really come up with creative solutions or be able to have innovation.
That's right. It's too hard otherwise to break out of our habits, our routines, our patterns, the things that we've created for ease and convenience. It keeps us safe, but it doesn't help us learn or create new ways, certainly being flexible and dealing with change. So we slip into evaluation too quickly. And in fact, we won't even really take the risk to share wacky ideas that we might otherwise try that could be somehow really great, lead to great innovation.
You mean like the wacky idea that we should do an improv webinar together?
Perhaps that one indeed.
So improvisers need to practice embracing mistakes. And so I wanted to just talk for a minute about this idea of embracing mistakes and how often it's had to happen. For every invention, there's been many risks taken. And for some reason, this made me think about the Wright brothers. Imagine if when their first powered flight was only 4 seconds long, if they'd say, oh my God, forget it, we failed, this is way too risky, we're not doing it anymore. They started their experimentation in flight in 1896. And it wasn't until 1902 that they created a glider. And they did 700 flights with that glider, 700 flights before they tried for powered flight. So they spent 7 years experimenting in order to get to that powered flight situation. So I think this risk-taking improv skill is particularly important for libraries as we come from a culture of authority and having the right answer. For a long time, there was a clear dividing line between the job of the librarian and the job of the rest of the staff. And as libraries transition to new staffing and service models, there are all kinds of risks people need to take. For instance, librarians are supposed to be the ones that know how to find information. They have training, they've been to school. These days, there are also many other savvy searchers on staff who may be social media experts and have their own blogs. And these could be any level of staff. This makes it hard to create policies or rules to determine exactly who is the best person to answer which kind of question. So you were telling me that one of your favorite activities, Chris, is to teach something that I call it the failure bow. Can you tell us a little bit about that and walk us through it?
Sure. One of my favorite reasons for teaching this is because of our own relationship to failure. Usually when we think about failure, we have, as you've put together, Cheryl, the slide, this is the body language of failure. It's very closed. We have our hands covering our face or touching our hair, something that says, yeah, don't punish me in a way. And as a result, we have a very kind of defeatist attitude when it comes to failure, just like if the Wright brothers had done it after only 4 seconds. And so if we think about, we really want to change the practice of how we see failure so that we can fail good-naturedly. And once we recover from having failed, we can move on to see what we can learn from our mistakes.
So we're going to actually ask everyone to do an activity. And if you're in a room with a bunch of people, this should be really fun. And Chris and I are also doing it.
That's right. We'll do it right now. So stand up where you are if you're seated, as many of us are. And we're going to ask you to stand up.
If you can.
If you may, right? And with your open body language, we want to say, arms raised with your hand above your shoulders, say something that seems counterintuitive. I failed.
I made a mistake.
I blew it.
I'm a loser.
I totally screwed up.
So hopefully there's a bit of laughter generated with whomever you're with, or maybe you got a chance to do it on your own. And I just want you to see that people are applauding the fact that maybe you just took a risk. Yay.
That's right. And as some of you even wrote in the chat window, I can't do it. It could be that it physically seems impossible to do because it's such a counterintuitive expression. Usually we reserve that smiling, open body language, positive victory for our victory lap when we've achieved greatness or done something wonderful. So let me ask through the yes-no poll again, did that feel weird to kind of celebrate failure?
So if you can use your yes-no buttons, did that feel weird to try to stand up and celebrate making a mistake?
Right. Early voting polls are in, and yes, it does. 5-1 so far.
And I love that Eileen said, no, it was fun.
Good. It's not a right or wrong answer, certainly, though it's just interesting to note that for many of us, in this case, pretty much a 4-to-1 margin, people found it strange or weird to celebrate failure in this way.
Okay. I'm going to go ahead and close the poll.
All right. Thank you. We're so used to looking for the error, what went wrong, and to your point about the professors, kind of circling something with the red pen and getting a grade based on that number of mistakes as opposed to the effort that we put in. We need to change that mentality when it comes to taking risks, those smart risks that we talked about, so that we can innovate.
Okay. So taking a risk is about what?
I would say it's about quieting the internal voice that censors an idea or judges our idea before it even has a chance to live or breathe. To beat ourselves up or our colleagues up and say that was a dumb idea. We want people to be allowed to fail with grace, to be flexible, spontaneous, that list that we saw earlier, being adaptable and present. All of these are risks in many environments to be that way. It's partly walking comfortably into the unknown to replace judgment with curiosity, which allows us to keep doors open.
Great. I love that idea for some reason. I keep thinking of that, curiosity instead of judgment. That's something I think I could certainly practice. So I think that one of the reasons that people are so uncomfortable taking risks in many libraries is that in the past, their contributions have been shot down or ignored. And I know this doesn't happen everywhere, and yet I do hear it pretty frequently from people. So when you imagine the last time or last few times you're in meetings and maybe somebody made a suggestion and very quickly their suggestion maybe got yes-butted, or even worse, maybe their suggestion got ignored. Once that happens, it feels like a really big risk to make suggestions again. So in some libraries, you could say, or workplaces, people have actually been trained not to participate. And I think that this is something we can absolutely change by practicing taking risks. So maybe consider the next time you're in a meeting, maybe create a rule that for 5 or 10 minutes in a meeting, you can only offer suggestions and everyone must yes and them. That would take the risk out of contributing ideas and help people feel heard. You might find that the person who tends to be quiet and stay out of things actually has some really, really good ideas that don't usually get heard.
That's right. I mean, it actually can inspire even more ideas if we allow certain ideas to be put forth. And as some of you mentioned in the chat window, in some cases it's the supervisor who wants to shut down that idea. So you can find yourself as a supervisor, be open to more ideas longer and see what happens. So I think all of these help us to understand that in some cases, yes, there will be risks associated that we may want to consider that in the evaluation process. But before that, when we're still coming up with ideas, let's let that idea generation phase have its own life without being separate from that evaluation.
Okay.
I think that leads us into our last skill of supporting your partner.
Great. All right. So, Chris, again, what does support your partner mean in the improv world?
Well, I think it means to make your partner look good, to focus on them and realize to reduce ego. It's about finding ways to help other people shine instead of taking the credit. It comes from a place of generosity and appreciation. It's noticing what's good about an offer.
Great, and it's been so fun to do this webinar with you because we've been supporting each other, which has made it really fun along the way as we were getting to this point, and still now.
That's true.
So I also think this idea of supporting your partner is about helping others when they're stuck, and also having the confidence that they're going to help you if you're stuck. So imagine a workplace where you count on your coworkers to support each other's ideas and decisions and to give constructive feedback without it turning into a blame game. I'm guessing that if there was more yes-anding in supporting your partner, we might find that many of the ideas or solutions or innovations we need are actually right in our own backyard. Well, I call that the Dorothy principle for those of you who are Wizard of Oz fans. So a lot of the work of applied improvisers out in the world has to do with innovation and creativity. And wouldn't it be nice if ideas really did come out of a can? But research shows that innovation comes from people collaborating, sharing knowledge, and experimenting, which for many requires risk-taking, of course. I mean, scientists experiment all the time, so it's not a big risk for them. It's actually a requirement. However, in libraries, there is high value placed on structure and organization and authority, which is almost the opposite of what's needed to take risks. We have a myth in America of the hero, that individuals are the ones that do great things, but it's not true. There's a lot of research that shows that innovations come from experience, hard work, contact with a lot of ideas, and opportunities to play. And during that play, you relax and you kind of get your head in space to think different, to think more broadly, to not be stuck. So one person may ultimately be the person to come up with the idea, but it came from all the conversations and experiences over time with many, many other people.
I really like that. Let's do a sample exercise that you can do with your work colleagues right where you are, or on your own.
And I'm hoping that some of you will actually type in the chat window. You know, this is sort of similar to the yes and activity, is to think about what's good about this, that more people are reading on digital devices. So those of you who can, if you would go ahead and type in the chat window, what might be good about this, that more people are reading on digital devices?
Yeah, more people are reading. That's obviously great. People are reading. It saves trees. Less back pain from lifting, yes. More library visits to your site, right. And informed people, great. Wow, these are lots of ideas. People can read anywhere. Great.
Excellent. Okay. So we've done 4 of the improv skills today. And there are many more than that. And they're highly intertwined, the ones we chose. And we wanted to talk about how do you get better at these skills and incorporating them into your day.
Well, as with anything, practice makes perfect. You know, I think it seems counterintuitive that improvisers would practice, that they would get together, since as many people pointed out what improvisation is sort of this unscripted, free-for-all, fly by the seat of your pants in the moment, and yet there's a lot of training that goes behind it. So one of the activities we'll try today is called Wrong Name. So I would invite you to, again, in the space where you are, be able to stand up or move about and point to things in the room that you're in and say aloud something by a name which it is not. So in other words, if you point to a mug, say something out loud, like candle, elephant, hula hoop, something that isn't a mug. So try this with at least 7 things in your environment. That's right. One example in our chat window, phone equals pizza, yes. So try it now.
In your room, wherever you are, with who's ever there, just start pointing at things and calling it the wrong name.
That's right. If many of you are in the room, it may be a cacophony of sound, that's fine.
Okay.
Hot tub, hula hoop, cactus, fire hydrant, nose, chimney, comet.
And by the way,
chart.
most of those are not actually in the office that Chris and I are sitting in.
That's true.
So I'm going to ask you now, assuming that you've been able to try this, was it difficult? Could you give us your yes-no feedback about whether that was difficult?
All right, we're starting to get some results in here. And interesting, it's about half and half. Half of you said yes, it was. Half said no, it wasn't. So that's great. I think that says a lot about whether it was easy or difficult. For those of you that it was easy, it might be interesting to say why it was in the window. For some of us, I think we're used to that type of bizarre zaniness in our day. We have to. Others, it becomes very difficult for us to look at something and call it by something else. We're so used to having labels.
I love this. It says, someone in the chat wrote, I think I should continue to call my coat Pine Tree. I love that.
Oh, great. Yeah, you can find a lot of nicknames or new terminology for some old things.
Okay. And I'm going to go ahead and close the poll. Thank you for participating. So I wanted to share with you 2 other library situations where these improv skills would have been really useful. I was in a meeting with a new team, and they were trying to decide if one person should facilitate or if they should rotate the facilitators amongst all the different people on the team. I'm guessing, again, that people have had to deal with this in their own teams. And one person said, I think we should rotate facilitators. And the next person spoke up and sounded a bit angry. He said, I'm not facilitating. And as you can imagine, the conversation just stopped dead, and the room got actually quite uncomfortable. And again, from my applied improv hat, I kind of said to myself, what's another option? It seems pretty obvious to me that yes-anding would say, well, we need facilitators, and some people might want to facilitate and some wouldn't. And the conversation could have just smoothly moved on to making a decision that worked for everyone. But that's not what happened. I was in another meeting and working with a library who was saying things like, we can't get our people to come to training. They say things like, it's not in my job description. They're afraid to ask for help because they'll get written up. What if the manager stopped thinking about making people follow rules and start thinking about how to support people to succeed? So stop thinking they don't want to do it and start realizing that some people feel like they don't have the tools to be successful. So again, it's just kind of a reframe. How can you be present and listen for what's really happening? How can you yes-and the people and support your partner? And you're probably going to be taking some risks along the way. Okay, so had people been practicing these improv skills, there probably would have been pretty easy solutions to those situations.
All right, so let's go ahead and review the skills that we've talked about today.
So be present, let go of your personal bias, create connections, and see opportunities.
Yes, and, which is showing a willingness to listen and to build on others' ideas.
Take risks, share ideas, worry less, and experiment more.
And support your partner. You don't have to do it alone. You've got others that will have your back and be watching out for you.
Great. And how do you, Chris, how do you help people learn and use these skills?
Well, there are literally hundreds of improv activities that we can use. So the challenge for us is finding the right activity for the right group and the right moment even. Sometimes I have to let go of an entire plan and say, we're going to try something new or different today with this group. So in part, as an individual on a team, we can actually practice some of these. So I encourage people to practice doing something like wrong name. For those of us that found it challenging, try it for 2 weeks, once a day, calling something by a different name than what it is, calling your phone a pizza, and see if you get better at doing it more quickly and that the ideas come and flow more naturally. The other time is, for another example, you might notice when you're getting set to judge an idea and say something critical, hold off on that judgment even for 30 seconds and just see what happens as a result. You may eventually need to address that, but by holding off on judgment, maybe you'll try something new that you might not have otherwise given the time of day, whether it's coming from a certain person you know or just based on what you think might happen with that idea based on its own merits.
So really, a lot of the idea of practicing stuff is sort of to shift things from being difficult or scary and switch them into being exciting and interesting and finding opportunities.
That's right. If we're afraid of ambiguity or change, maybe we can figure out how to enjoy ambiguity and change by being able to embrace it using some of these skills.
Great. I mean, certainly the world's not going to stop changing, so why not build the abilities that will allow us to thrive in those circumstances? So in case you're thinking this is all coming from way out in left field or right field, I wanted to share with you that in the November-December 2011 Public Libraries magazine, I was delighted to find this article talking about yes and creating a culture of yes. So the PLA president, Marsha Warner, said, we found our organization opening up after a communications training session that taught the yes and principle. And what would happen if your organizational culture was one of yes? So a lot of people talk about this, creating a culture of yes, but I don't know of anyone who talks about how to do it. So why not practice by using the games and activities that the best improvisers use to hone their craft? It's guaranteed to be fun while you're doing it, and it can be transformative in both your personal and professional life. I certainly know that it has been for me. And it's nice to see that some library folks, like Paula, actually agree.
That's right. These activities today have been fun, and these are activities that we chose with the audience of one in mind so that you could do on your own. And as we know with improv activities, most of them are most fun when you get to do it with a partner, a small group, or even a large group.
Yeah. So hopefully those of you who are in a group had some fun and got the energy from the entire group. And I wanted to tell you that there is going to be an Info People workshop on the skills of improvisation coming in spring for the California libraries. It's going to be the kind of old-fashioned Info People all-day workshop. So it'll be open registration like in the old days. And I'd say come alone or with a buddy or with an existing team if you have one. And then you can also, if you can't make it to the open registration workshops, like all Info People workshops, you can actually contract for our workshops so that we'll bring it to you. And this could be maybe for your management team, it could be to bring to all your staff at a staff day, or for any groups that need to work together for the good of the library. So we really appreciate everybody being here, and we've left a couple of minutes for Q&A. So if people have questions for either myself or Chris or both of us, we're all ears at this point. And I'm not sure if at this point if we're going to get, if Eileen will tell us the questions or if we need to find the questions. So hang on for a minute while we improvise.
Well, everybody should, if you have a question for Cheryl or Chris, you should type it into the text chat now. And here's a question for you. Is there a place online to find improv games?
That's a good question. There are many places to find improv games. There's something, and I have to double check whether it's still there, called the Improv Encyclopedia, which is actually full of games. And Chris?
That's right. I think there are a lot of online resources. Some of them have better explanations than others, so I think it's about finding, just researching those resources. There are books as well, the Improv Playbook. There are several different ones that I think are helpful. As we know, most of the improv activities are more fun to actually do them, be engaged in them, than kind of reading about them and kind of understanding how they work. It's more about participating, engaging, trying them out.
There definitely are a lot of pretty simple games. I mean, the games can get very, very, I shouldn't say complex, but I mean, they get to be more and more advanced. But there are a lot of simple games that you can do with your staff before meetings or at staff days, things like that.
I see one question. Tell us again what we should learn about what we should learn from the wrong name game. I think part of what happens is it's keeping your mind flexible to be open-minded. We get so caught up into pointing at something, giving it a label, giving it a name, and assuming its limitations, right? We have the universe of possibility. We can call it anything other than that name, and sometimes we struggle, especially if you do more than 5 or 10 or so. After a while, you kind of get stuck, and it's like, well, we get so used to thinking what an object is or a person is, right? Oh, that's the naysayer. Oh, that's the judge. Oh, that's the person who's here to shoot down my ideas. We kind of put that label on someone instead of thinking, they could actually be someone different today. So I think it's about keeping an open-mindedness, certainly being present, and to realize how fixed our patterns, routines, and habits. It's about breaking those patterns and routines and habits that we get accustomed to so that we can create and innovate more.
Yeah, that's great. I mean, I think anything that makes us more aware of our own stuckness or attention blindness or places we have a hard time being flexible. And for some of you who didn't find that activity difficult, that might all sound kind of strange. For a lot of people, that activity is tremendously difficult, and it's sort of eye-opening to realize how hard it is to point to something and call it something it's not.
For those of you that didn't get the challenge out of it, you can also try saying, find a word that rhymes with that word, find a word that starts with the same letter as that word, or even replace the wrong name with another wrong name. So you can't call it the first wrong name you were thinking of. You have to call it the second one. There are ways that we can make it even more challenging. In part, we just want our brains to be expansive and our minds to be challenged a little bit in a fun, playful way.
Yeah, one of the games that I've done at some workshops that you can do with your staff that's similar to that is to take something like you know, a handkerchief or a napkin and play the game of what is this, and encourage people to call it by, again, what it's not, but that it could be. So somebody might come up with it's an apron for a doll, and it's a sun hat for a, you know, pigeon, or a whole bunch of it's a, you know, it's a picnic table for some trolls, things like that.
That's right. It's a lot of fun. It produces a lot of laughter, and sometimes it creates new ideas that you start using, and you actually find new uses for objects that you wouldn't have otherwise used it for.
Right. And so we're going to see if there's any other questions. I don't know, Eileen, if you're seeing them, I'm happy to get fed them. As we're talking, it's hard to read the questions coming in.
There's a boatload of text. It's actually hard to keep up. But,
okay. I did see one question in there about dealing with difficult customers, and I think somebody actually responded to it in chat. You know, that the idea of yes-anding and being present and listening. In almost all of the literature around either being facilitators or in conflict negotiation, even in, you know, enormously difficult situations in different conflict resolution, listening turns out to be the most important skill, or you might call the skill helping people be heard or making people feel heard. And when you can do that, often even your most difficult situations can turn into, can be turned around, I should say. The trick is to not get defensive and get into your own fight or flight reaction to those things.
As one person said, you could respond with, here's what we can do, instead of saying no. And I think, to your point, Cheryl, it's exactly right. A lot of times, once people are heard, they feel like that part of that stress, they just wanted to get that off their chest. And it's been shared, and now they can recover. I think the idea of getting naysayers to be more comfortable is really a challenge. It comes from a self-awareness place, and it takes practice. And in some cases, just returning them that courtesy of not shutting down their ideas, they may notice how it feels good not to have an idea shut down so quickly. I think that's another place where we can just model some of the behaviors. And obviously, the more of these skills that are being used in communication, I think the more effective our meetings will be, our conversations will be.
Yeah, and I think there's one more question. How do you get an inveterate naysayer to be more comfortable in taking that 30 seconds? And that's a really, really good question. And there's a bunch of activities I do, and I'm guessing Chris has a bunch also, that have to do with helping people notice that reaction. Because a lot of times what happens is people have a negative reaction, but they don't realize, for one, that it's negative. To some people, that's just so normal that they didn't even think there was an opportunity to have a different reaction. And they don't also realize that it's a reaction as opposed to a response. In other words, we do things like teach people to count to 5 before they say anything out loud, to help people notice how often the response is negative, and to, you know, sometimes I tell people, I'm not sure why we're all okay having negative responses, because a positive response, it seems like, is just as likely as a negative, and yet we mostly spend our time thinking about the negative instead of the positive. So what about just giving some equal weight to a potentially positive response? And I think you can then sort of, you know, that's a pretty reasonable argument for most people, and you can then sort of kind of play the game of let's just work on some positives for a while.
I think so. Well, thank you. I think that's the end of our time. Thank you so much, Cheryl, for the opportunity to present today.
Yes, thank you so much, Chris, for taking the risk to play with me today on this webinar. And for all of you that came, thanks very much for taking that risk with us. And if you have questions for us, I've got our email addresses up on the screen, and hope to see you in an InfoPeople, another webinar or workshop. Thanks very much.
Great. Thank you all. Bye-bye.